They say the rich will always get richer, and the poor will forever stay poor. Yet John D. Rockefeller, a boy born into crushing poverty to a professional con artist for a father, managed to rewrite that rule. He shattered an unjust system to become the first billionaire in human history, building the Standard Oil empire. He controlled 90% of the oil refining industry, possessing enough power to strangle competitors, manipulate Congress, and stand toe-to-toe with presidents and the most powerful banks in the nation. But the most terrifying part is not how he amassed his wealth. It is how he built a flawless system to ensure no one else could ever do it again. Are you curious about how the mind of such a ruler operates? And what modern traps the ultra-rich are laying down today to keep ordinary people permanently stuck in the middle class? Let us explore his story, and perhaps find a way out of the maze. The mind of a man who feared chaos. The root of his absolute ambition for control did not begin in a boardroom. It began with a father who lived by completely different rules. William Rockefeller, known to the world as Devil Bill, was hardly a reliable family patriarch. Outwardly charming, he lived a nomadic life as a pitchman, mesmerist, animal trainer, and illusionist. For weeks on end, Devil Bill would vanish without a trace, leaving his wife and young children to fend off hunger and the bitter winter cold. Then, without warning, he would return in a luxurious carriage, tossing expensive toys and gifts to his children like a benevolent god. But behind that glamorous facade lay a stark reality. William was a professional grifter, traveling from town to town selling useless herbal remedies to the sick and desperate, under the alias of Dr. William Livingston. This constant uncertainty inflicted deep psychological wounds on young John. When he was 10 years old, a heavier blow struck. His father was accused of assaulting a local teenage girl. Though never officially convicted by a court, the scandal plunged the family into utter humiliation, forcing them to pack up and flee from one town to the next. Even after they relocated, Devil Bill continued to betray his family. He secretly married another woman under a fake name, living a double life and completely vanishing from his duties as a husband and father. In a household constantly rocking from lies and deprivation, John was forced to grow up fast. He became the unspoken patriarch of the home. He plowed the fields alongside his mother, figured out how to trap wild turkeys in the woods to sell their eggs, and meticulously managed their dwindling daily expenses. When the family was so destitute they could barely survive, it was John who began lending tiny sums of money to neighbors at a nominal interest rate, learning to make money multiply before he was even of age. John's deepest fear was not poverty. It was chaos. It was the feeling of total powerlessness in the face of his father's deceptions and unpredictability. That fear molded a mind obsessed with absolute precision. At 16, with just 2 months left until his high school graduation, the financial pressure mounted. The number of younger siblings grew, and his father's absences stretched longer. John had to make a ruthless decision regarding his own youth. He dropped out of school and went straight to the city of Cleveland to find work. For 6 straight weeks, the slight figure of the 16-year-old boy appeared at every major bank, railroad company, and merchant in the city, only to be met with laughter and rejection for being too young. Yet, no insult could break his cold determination. Finally, a small produce commission firm agreed to hire John as a mere bookkeeper, simply because they were impressed by his flawless penmanship. September 26, 1855, the day he officially started work, was etched into John's memory forever. He celebrated it for the rest of his life as Job Day, a personal holiday far more sacred than his own birthday. From that apprentice desk, John began a habit he would keep until his dying day. He carried a small brown pocket ledger, recording every single cent earned, every minute expense, and every charitable donation. He woke at 5 in the morning every day, reading his Bible and praying in silence. He wore a simple onyx ring on his finger and wore his clothes until they were threadbare. To John, wealth was not meant for lavish displays. It was proof that he was pleasing God through extreme diligence and thrift. But beneath that pious exterior lay a psychological defense mechanism. By controlling every loose penny, He was trying to overcompensate for the chaos and insecurity his father had planted in his childhood mind. The fear of losing control transformed into a habit of managing every number and every hour of the day, and soon enough, that habit was forced upon everyone around him. A marriage built on iron discipline. When John D. Rockefeller sought a life partner, he was not looking for a romantic muse or a high society debutante who knew how to dress for elite tea parties. He chose Laura Spelman, a woman who shared his austere Baptist faith and his core values of thrift, order, and iron discipline. Their home did not resemble a glittering tycoon's estate filled with bright lights and lively chatter. It felt more like a miniature monastery, where everything operated on a suffocatingly strict schedule. There was no room for petty jealousy, no tolerance for idle tantrums, and absolutely zero acceptance of waste, no matter how small. Laura was one of the rare people on earth with the moral authority to stand before John, critique her husband's arrogance, and force him to rein in his combative nature. The way they ran their household was exactly how they managed a small business. The Rockefeller children did not grow up in permissive luxury. They were taught to earn every penny of their allowance by pulling weeds in the garden. They kept their own ledgers, just like their father, and learned that every gift had to be paid for with hard work. But the cost of a family machine running on such strict discipline was steep, especially for the next generation. John D. Rockefeller Jr., the only son burdened with the pressure to inherit and protect the massive family fortune, grew up in the heavy shadow of his father. Young Jr. frequently sank into deep depressions. He felt guilty whenever he spent money he had not personally earned, and he struggled desperately to find an identity that was not eclipsed by his father's monumental legacy. It took the guidance of Frederick Gates, a wise former minister hired by John Sr. to manage his assets, along with deep involvement in community philanthropy, for Jr. to gradually find his way and learn to stand firm in the world his father had created. What John Sr. passed down to his children was not merely massive numbers in a bank account, it was a complete system of thinking. He taught cash flow discipline, cold detachment in decision-making, and above all, a carefully calculated network of relationships. This was the cultural and social capital forged over generations, creating a fortress that those in the lower classes, no matter how hard they worked, could almost never breach. The true strength of the Rockefeller family lay not in how much money they held, but in how they taught their children to wield money as a strategic weapon. And when that mind, molded by insecurity, iron discipline, and a fear of chaos, stepped out of the family home, it immediately turned the entire American economy into a massive laboratory. The monopoly as a cure for chaos. Stepping into the business world after his early years as a bookkeeper, John quickly realized that free market competition was the worst form of chaos. In his eyes, a market crowded with small, uncoordinated rivals stepping on each other's toes was no different from the disorganized mess of wandering medicine peddlers like his father. It was precarious, undisciplined, and full of risk. Between 1855 and 1861, transitioning from his days as a hired clerk, John partnered with Morris Clark to form the produce commission firm Clark and Rockefeller. From his very first steps, his instinct for control revealed itself in how he raised capital. They visited banks across Cleveland, boldly claiming the company was preparing a massive $10,000 investment, even though they only had half that amount. They created a dazzling facade that made banks willingly hand over the cash. When the Civil War broke out, instead of rushing to the battlefield, John opted to pay $300 for a substitute to fight in his place. Meanwhile, he poured his resources into supplying goods to the Union Army. That leverage multiplied their produce revenues, bringing in a $17,000 profit by 1862, an astronomical sum for a young man of 23. But the real opportunity for expansion did not lie in beans or corn. It lay in a dark, thick liquid just discovered in Pennsylvania. Before electricity, homes were lit by whale oil, a resource that was rapidly depleting and growing incredibly expensive. When the first oil wells were drilled into the earth, this black gold became an open-air treasure trove. Spotting the opportunity, John partnered with Samuel Andrews, a young engineer who had perfected a formula, using sulfuric acid to refine crude oil into kerosene. It was a product that burned brighter, lasted longer, and was cleaner than anything else on the market. In 1865, John made a pivotal decision. He pooled his savings and borrowed heavily to buy out Maurice Clark's share for $72,500, equivalent to well over $1 million today. Maurice chose to take the money and walk away, while John threw himself into an all-or-nothing gamble. He renamed the company Standard Oil and recruited Henry Flagler, a man with an equally cold mindset. Flagler viewed business as war, and the only rule for winning was the total annihilation of the enemy. To control the board, John did not risk everything on the unpredictable business of drilling for oil. Instead, he focused entirely on refining and transportation, the bottlenecks of the entire industry. He secretly struck deals with major railroads like the New York Central and the Erie. While every other competitor was bleeding cash to pay exorbitant freight rates, Standard Oil received discounts of up to 75% in exchange for guaranteeing massive daily shipment volumes. These secret rebates were kept completely hidden from the rest of the world. Armed with a lower cost basis than anyone else, John began to strangle the market. He deliberately dropped the price of kerosene below his competitors' production costs. Smaller firms quietly followed suit just to keep their customers, unaware that every gallon they sold pushed them closer to bankruptcy, while Standard Oil still reaped huge profits thanks to its secret railroad kickbacks. When his rivals were exhausted and broken, John would appear like a savior, buying up their refineries for pennies on the dollar. This aggressive expansion peaked in the spring of 1871 with a notorious alliance known as the South Improvement Company. Partnering with Tom Scott, the powerful head of the Pennsylvania Railroad, John formed a secret syndicate of the largest refiners to corner the nation's oil transport. They planned to punish anyone outside their circle by forcing them to pay higher freight rates. And shockingly, those extra surcharges were funneled directly into the pockets of Standard Oil. When the secret leaked, outrage exploded. Thousands of miners and refinery owners flooded the streets, vandalizing trains, tearing up tracks, and threatening violence. Though the alliance was forced to dissolve in deep humiliation after just 2 months, John did not flinch. He swiftly shifted his tactics to direct intimidation. In a 6-week campaign that history would later call the Cleveland Massacre, John summoned the local refinery owners. He slid his financial ledgers across the table to prove they could not possibly survive against the might of Standard Oil, and offered them a single choice. They could either sign a contract selling their plants for a fraction of their worth, or they could face total bankruptcy in despair. 22 out of the 26 refineries bowed their heads and sold. When the nationwide economic panic hit in the fall of 1873, known as Black Thursday, it triggered a 6-year depression. Oil prices plummeted to 48 cents a barrel, cheaper than drinking water. Bankruptcies echoed everywhere, but Standard Oil, armed with vast cash reserves, solid credit, and highly modernized plants, stood firm and continued to expand. John swept through Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York, swallowing up the majority of the nation's refining capacity. He began building a tangled network of underground pipelines across the eastern seaboard, stripping away his dependence on the railroads. Like the tentacles of a giant creature stretching across the market, the nickname the Octopus was born. By this point, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of the oil refining industry in the United States. But the monster did not stop at small competitors. When Tom Scott, once an ally, became a rival by building his own pipelines and refineries, John immediately declared war. He severed all shipping contracts with the Pennsylvania Railroad, diverted his freight to other lines, and slashed oil prices to completely wipe out his rivals' profit margins. That one fierce battle indirectly sparked some of the bloodiest labor strikes in American history, leaving thousands of workers jobless and hundreds of train cars and facilities burning in oceans of fire. Ultimately, the giant Pennsylvania Railroad fell. Tom Scott broke down and passed away in bitter resentment. Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King and Scott's former protege, witnessed his mentor's demise and swore never to forgive John, igniting a legendary rivalry between the kings of oil and steel. John's pinnacle of power continued to rise when he acquired the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, the largest source of raw iron ore for the steel industry. Realizing the danger of John swallowing the entire steel market, Carnegie was forced to compromise. He agreed to buy iron ore from John's mines in exchange for unprecedented shipping privileges. The consolidation did not stop there. The formidable banker J.P. Morgan eventually stepped in, buying out both empires to form U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in human history. A massive portion of those shares went to the Rockefeller family, pushing their wealth beyond all imagination. John had fought the chaos of the market by establishing an order of absolute monopoly, using the numbers in his pocket ledger to silence all competitive noise. But when the fortress walls were built too high, resentful eyes from the outside began searching for a way to climb over and look inside. The ultimate prize of philanthropy and isolation. Although John D. Rockefeller had quietly stepped away from daily operations long ago, he still held about 30% of Standard Oil's shares. Thanks to the boom of the automobile industry and the insatiable demand for gasoline, his wealth during his retirement years did not diminish. Instead, it swelled at a dizzying pace. But by then, the name John D. Rockefeller had become a national symbol of greed and ruthlessness. That resentment was powerfully fueled by the pen of journalist Ida Tarbell, whose own father's business had been crushed by Standard Oil. In a sharp, widely read investigative series, Tarbell stripped away every dark corner of the oil empire's past, from the secret extortionate railroad contracts and the political bribery, all the way to the bitter personal secrets of John's grifter father. The American public consumed every line with absolute fury. Seeing a political opportunity in that wave of public anger, President Theodore Roosevelt raised the banner of antitrust reform. The federal government launched a historic lawsuit against Standard Oil, armed with thousands of pages of evidence, hundreds of witnesses, and legal battles that dragged on for years. On May 15, 1911, the United States Supreme Court officially found Standard Oil guilty and ordered the massive trust to be dissolved into 34 separate companies. Many celebrated, believing Rockefeller's empire had finally collapsed. But the reality was more ironic than any script. When Standard Oil was shattered into 34 pieces, John maintained his exact percentage of ownership in every single newly formed company. In a remarkably short time, driven by the explosive growth of the modern economy, the combined value of those shares multiplied. This pushed John's personal fortune past all known limits, officially making him the world's first billionaire and leaving Andrew Carnegie trailing far behind. Acutely aware that such immense wealth paired with public hatred was a dangerous burden, John redirected his energy into a new field, scientific philanthropy. In 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation alongside Frederick Gates and his son, John Jr. Over his lifetime, he personally donated over $540 million, an astronomical figure for the era, not to mention hundreds of millions more from the foundation and his son. They poured money into founding the University of Chicago, shaping educational systems nationwide, and funding public health initiatives to eradicate rampaging diseases like hookworm, malaria, and meningitis. Yet, a sentiment often attributed to those years suggested he wanted a nation of diligent workers rather than independent thinkers. The educational models he backed largely provided practical skills for laborers rather than teaching the deep structures of finance or economic independence. At the same time, the family's network of power expanded through strategic organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations. Years earlier, to protect his interests, Rockefeller had financially backed the presidential campaigns of William McKinley, securing a political corridor that tolerated his monopolistic expansion. While rumors and public theories have long circulated that the Rockefeller family was behind the creation of the Federal Reserve to control the National Monetary System, claims that have never been conclusively proven by legal documents, no one can deny that their influence transcended a standard business enterprise. They had elevated themselves into a shadow power structure managing the nation. This endless wealth was encased within the Kikuit estate, sitting high on the Pocantico Hills overlooking the Hudson River. Kikuit was not just a vacation home. It was a literal fortress with towering stone walls and intense security systems designed to completely isolate the billionaire from the prying eyes of the press and the anger of the public outside. Living in one of the most magnificent estates in America, John had essentially locked himself in absolute isolation, where everything was perfectly controlled, except for the loneliness of his own old age, modern traps, and protecting family wealth. Looking back at the journey of John D. Rockefeller, one realizes that his tactics never truly vanished. They merely changed shape to fit a new era. In the old days, Rockefeller used secret freight discounts and artificially cheap kerosene to lure smaller refineries into his monopolistic trap. Today, the bait appears in much more sophisticated disguises. It might be a seminar promising quick wealth in just a few sessions, unrealistic guarantees of massive returns in the financial markets, free tech platforms harvesting personal data, or buy now pay later schemes that encourage consumption far beyond one's actual means. The underlying mechanism remains exactly as it was a century ago. They capture human attention with a small, immediate benefit, create the illusion that the individual is in control, and then slowly herd them into a system where, the longer they stay, the more they suffer hidden costs, extortionate interest rates, or long-term financial drains. The feeling of missing out, combined with the psychological pull of a quick bargain, is the most effective tool to keep the working class trapped in a cycle of financial dependency. Furthermore, inflation and the devaluation of cash act as a hidden tax, eroding the wealth of those who only know how to keep their money in traditional savings accounts. Meanwhile, the ultra-rich always know how to anchor their fortunes to irreplaceable assets. They hold land, essential corporate shares, energy, and core technologies. Earning a low interest rate in a bank account is never enough to outpace the skyrocketing costs of healthcare, education, and daily living, leaving ordinary families entirely vulnerable to every economic shock. Faced with this reality, the lesson to take away is not bitter resentment toward the wealthy. It is the clarity to recognize the financial structures built all around us. A wise person never lunges for the bait without understanding the true nature of the system behind it. They learn to build multiple alternative streams of income and properly allocate their assets into real value, like gold, silver, real estate, or shares in fundamentally solid companies, rather than squandering money on fleeting illusions. Most importantly, they teach their children patience, the mindset of genuine cash flow management, and the power of self-reliance, rather than chasing quick-fix wealth tricks designed by others on a digital screen. The two-faced legacy of a ruthless mind. John D. Rockefeller Sr. lived a life that redefined the entire structure of the modern economy. He stands as living proof that a man born at the very bottom of society can claw his way to the absolute peak through iron discipline, calculated ruthlessness, and a mind that refuses to surrender to circumstance. But at the same time, he is the very man who built the most impenetrable fences to prevent anyone else from following in his footsteps. Rockefeller's executive mind was the combined product of his fear of the chaos brought on by Devil Bill, his austere Baptist faith, and an insatiable desire to control every minute detail of his existence. From the pocket ledger that tracked every stray penny to the cutthroat tactics that choked out his rivals, and from his monastery-like home to the philanthropic system that shaped national education, every action he took pointed toward a single goal. He sought to establish order under his own supreme authority. The system he left behind did not vanish when he passed away at the age of 97. It continues to operate silently all around us, in forms far more modern and sophisticated. And the question for each of us is no longer whether John D. Rockefeller was a saint or a ruthless demon. The reality we face is much more immediate. Are we, whether intentionally or completely unaware, still playing by the rule book written in cold numbers by a poor boy from Cleveland over a century ago? True clarity begins the moment we recognize exactly who is holding the pen that writes the rules of the game, and we finally refuse to be a cog in their machine of endless privilege.